Night in the Wilderness. A real-life hunting horror story. Hunting, for many, is a tradition passed down through generations, a rite of passage, and a way to connect with nature. However, it can also be a harrowing experience, fraught with unexpected dangers. This is the true account of a night that turned a routine hunting trip into a life-altering ordeal. A story that underscores the unpredictable and often perilous nature of the wilderness. The start of the expedition. In the fall of 2003, my Uncle Joe, an experienced hunter, decided to take my cousin Mark and me on our first overnight hunting trip. We had been hunting before, but always returned home by dusk. This time, we would camp deep in the woods of northern Minnesota, aiming to hunt deer and experience the wilderness in a way we never had before. Joe had been hunting these woods since he was a teenager and knew the area like the back of his hand. His confidence in our safety was reassuring. We set out on a crisp October morning. The leaves were a riot of reds, oranges, and yellows, and the air was cool and invigorating. We drove as far as the dirt roads allowed, then hiked another 6 miles into the forest, laden with our gear. Joe led the way, his rifle slung over his shoulder, constantly scanning the landscape for signs of deer. Setting up camp. We reached our campsite by mid-afternoon, a small clearing near a bubbling creek. It was a perfect spot, remote, with plenty of game trails nearby. We set up our tent, gathered firewood, and prepared for the hunt. Joe instructed us on setting up deer stands and traps, emphasizing the importance of silence and patience. As dusk approached, we settled around the campfire, roasting hot dogs and sharing stories. The forest around us was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures awakening. Joe reminded us of the plan for the next day. We would rise before dawn, split up, and take our positions. The anticipation of the hunt filled the air. The first signs of trouble. In the early hours of the morning, something startled us awake. It was a distant guttural howl, unlike anything I had ever heard. Joe dismissed it as a wolf or coyote, common in these parts. Nevertheless, a sense of unease settled over me. Mark and I exchanged nervous glances but trusted Joe's expertise. The following day passed uneventfully. We spotted a few deer but were unable to get a clean shot. As evening fell, we returned to our camp. Joe seemed distracted, often looking towards the tree line as if expecting something. He mentioned seeing unusual tracks, larger than any he had encountered before. The encounter. That night, the howling returned, closer and more intense. This time, it was accompanied by the sound of branches snapping and something large moving through the underbrush. Joe grabbed his rifle and flashlight, gesturing for us to stay close. The three of us crept towards the source of the noise, hearts pounding. Suddenly, a massive, shadowy figure burst from the trees. It was a bear, but unlike any bear we had seen. It was enormous, with matted fur and a wild, frenzied look in its eyes. Joe fired a warning shot into the air, but the bear didn't flinch. It charged at us with terrifying speed. Joe fired again, this time hitting the bear in the shoulder. The creature rolled in pain and retreated into the darkness. Shaken, we retreated to the camp, Joe reloading his rifle and muttering under his breath. He admitted that he had never seen a bear act so aggressively. We kept the fire burning bright and took turns keeping watch throughout the night. Sleep was impossible, as every rustle and snap in the forest kept us on edge. The night seemed to stretch on forever. Each minute felt like an hour as we listened intently for any sign of the bear's return. Around midnight, we heard it again. The heavy, deliberate steps of something large circling our camp. The bear's growls were low and menacing, sending chills down our spines. Joe instructed us to stay in the tent while he stood guard outside, his rifle at the ready. I could see the tension in Joe's face, the way his eyes darted around the perimeter of the camp. He was a seasoned hunter, but this situation was unlike any he had faced before. The bear was not acting out of hunger or fear. It seemed driven by something more primal, more sinister. The hours dragged by, each sound amplified by the darkness. At one point, we heard the bear attacking our supplies, tearing through our food and gear. Joe fired a few more warning shots, but the bear was undeterred. It felt like a siege, as if the bear was intent on driving us out of its territory. Dawn and discovery. When the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the bear finally retreated. We emerged from the tent, exhausted and on edge. The campsite was a mess. Our food was gone, and our gear was scattered and damaged. Joe decided it was too dangerous to stay any longer. We packed up what we could and prepared to hike back to the car. As we made our way through the forest, the sense of being watched never left us. Every rustle, every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Joe led the way, his rifle always at the ready. We moved quickly, driven by the primal urge to get out of the bear's territory. The final stretch. The hike back to the car was grueling. Our nerves were frayed, and every step felt like it could be our last. Joe kept a steady pace, but I could see the worry etched on his face. He was constantly scanning the surroundings, his finger never far from the trigger. About halfway to the car, we heard the bear again. It was following us, staying just out of sight, but close enough to remind us of its presence. Joe decided we needed to make a stand. We found a defensible position, a rocky outcrop that gave us a clear view of the forest around us. Joe positioned us behind the rocks and instructed us to stay quiet. For what felt like hours, we waited. The bear's growls grew louder, and we could hear it moving through the underbrush. Then it appeared at the edge of the clearing, staring at us with those wild eyes. Joe took aim and fired, hitting the bear in the chest. The bear roared in pain and charged. Joe fired again and again until the bear finally collapsed, its body skidding to a halt just a few feet from us. The aftermath. The relief was overwhelming. We had survived, but the encounter had left us shaken to our core. Joe inspected the bear, confirming it was dead. He remarked on its size and the unusual behavior, noting that something must have driven it to such aggression, perhaps disease or injury. We made it back to the car without further incident. The drive home was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. The experience had changed us. We have faced a primal fear, a reminder of the wildness that still exists in the world. Reflection. In the years since that harrowing night, I often think about the fragility of our place in nature. As humans, we often believe we are at the top of the food chain, but experiences like this remind us of our vulnerability. The wilderness is beautiful and awe-inspiring, but it is also indifferent to our presence. It follows its own rules, and we must respect them. This experience has deepened my respect for nature and the creatures that inhabit it. It has also made me more cautious and aware when venturing into the wild. The memory of that bear, with its wild eyes and relentless pursuit, serves as a reminder that the wilderness is not a playground. It is a domain that demands respect and vigilance. Our night in the wilderness was a sobering lesson in the realities of hunting and survival. It was a reminder that while we may venture into nature seeking adventure and connection, we must always be prepared for the unexpected. And sometimes, those unexpected encounters can be terrifying, leaving an indelible mark on our souls. Into the Wilderness. A scary hunting horror story. Hunting has always been an activity that treads the fine line between exhilaration and terror. As someone who has spent countless hours in the wild, I can attest that nature holds its own set of rules that are often unforgiving and indifferent to human presence. This is the true account of a hunting trip that took a dark and unforgettable turn, forever altering my perspective on the wilderness. Preparation and departure. It was late October, the peak of hunting season in the dense forests of northern Canada. My friend Jack and I had been planning this trip for months. The area we chose was renowned for its abundance of elk and deer, and we had our sights set on bagging a trophy buck. We meticulously prepared our gear, ensuring we had everything from rifles and ammunition to camping supplies and GPS devices. The weather forecast predicted clear skies, a rare blessing for that time of year. We set off early in the morning, the crisp air filled with the scent of pine and earth. Our destination was a remote region known as Black Ridge, a place few dared to venture due to its rugged terrain and isolation. After a 6-hour drive and another 2 hours of hiking, we reached our campsite, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering fir trees. Our first day in the forest was uneventful. We tracked a few elk, but decided to save our energy for the following days. The forest was eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves and distant bird calls breaking the silence. As dusk settled in, we set up our tents and lit a small fire, cooking a modest meal of beans and sausages. The night was cold, and the clear sky revealed a blanket of stars. As we sat by the fire, sharing stories and laughing, an unsettling feeling crept over me. I dismissed it as nerves, knowing that the wilderness can play tricks on the mind. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. A disturbing discovery. The second day started with a sense of determination. We split up, planning to cover more ground. Jack headed east while I ventured west. We kept in contact via walkie-talkies, checking in every hour. By midday, I had spotted a few deer, but nothing worth taking a shot at. I decided to head back to camp for lunch. As I made my way through the dense underbrush, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. There, in a small clearing, was a freshly killed deer. Its body was torn apart, entrails strewn across the ground. This wasn't the work of a hunter. It was too brutal. My first thought was a bear or a wolf pack, but the sheer savagery of the scene suggested something else, something far more terrifying. I radioed Jack, urging him to return to camp immediately. His voice crackled with concern, and he promised to be back within the hour. As I waited, the forest seemed to close in around me, every sound amplified and sinister. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The encounter. Jack returned, and I showed him the gruesome discovery. His face paled, and we both agreed that we needed to be extra cautious. We decided to stay together for the remainder of the trip, safety in numbers. The day passed without further incident, but the sense of unease lingered. That night, as we sat by the fire, the forest seemed to come alive with sounds. Twigs snapped in the distance, and the underbrush rustled as if something was moving through it. We both strained our ears, trying to pinpoint the source, but the darkness concealed everything beyond the firelight. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. It was unlike anything I had ever heard, a mix of human agony and animalistic rage. Jack and I jumped to our feet, rifles at the ready. The scream echoed through the forest, sending shivers down my spine. We decided to stay awake in shifts, one of us keeping watch while the other tried to sleep. The night passed slowly, every minute stretching into an eternity. When dawn finally broke, we were exhausted but relieved. The decision to leave. After the previous night's events, we made the decision to cut our trip short. The forest felt hostile, and neither of us wanted to risk another encounter with whatever was out there. We packed up our gear and began the long hike back to our car. As we made our way through the forest, we couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every so often, we would hear the faint crack of a branch or the rustle of leaves. We moved as quickly and quietly as possible, our nerves on edge. About halfway to the car, we came across more signs of carnage. Another deer, this one in a similar state to the first. The realization hit us hard. We were in the territory of a predator, one that was not afraid of humans. The final ordeal. Our pace quickened as we neared the end of the trail. Just when we thought we were safe, we heard it again, the scream. This time, it was closer, much closer. Panic set in, and we broke into a run, the forest blurring around us. As we emerged from the tree line, we saw our car parked just ahead. Relief washed over us, but it was short-lived. Behind us, the underbrush exploded with movement. Jack turned and fired a shot into the trees, the sound echoing through the forest. Whatever was chasing us stopped, but we didn't wait to see what it was. We scrambled into the car and sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. The drive home was silent, both of us processing what had happened. We never spoke of it again, and that trip marked the end of our hunting adventures. Reflections. Years have passed since that fateful trip, but the memory remains vivid. I've often wondered what we encountered in those woods. Was it a bear driven to madness by hunger? A rogue wolf with a taste for blood? Or something else, something beyond our understanding? The wilderness is a place of beauty and danger, where the line between predator and prey can blur in an instant. That trip to Black Ridge taught me to respect nature's power and unpredictability. It's a lesson I carry with me to this day, a reminder that the wild is never truly tamed. In the end, our hunting horror story serves as a cautionary tale. For those who venture into the unknown, it's a stark reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones that share our world, flesh and blood, teeth and claws, lurking just beyond the edge of the firelight.